Catherine's been introducing the sessions this morning. Now, my turn to introduce her very briefly and just sets the stage as we shift gear and move on to looking at vaccines and away from the pharmaceuticals for a second. So, question is, why look at vaccines? Well, we've seen that there has been lots of activity in the vaccine segment, and that's really been driven by the COVID-19, that the pipelines become very active, and driven also by some of the quite large, big approvals and successful launches. However, when we look at that pipeline, it's actually concentrated in a small segment where we already have vaccines approved. Now, that can be a facilitator for access as we have a path that's been forged, but it can also create competitive pressures. And in contrast, we have other segments of underserved health needs. Another reason to look at it is that with the COVID-19 vaccines experience, we've seen that when there is a public health emergency, the process to approval and access to the vaccine can actually be quite rapid. But for the majority of vaccines, that is far from reality. It takes a long time, which makes us ask questions around what is that pathway and who are really the stakeholders who are driving the decision to make a vaccine available to eligible patients. And the stakeholders that influence vaccine market access include some of those usual suspects from the pharmaceutical market access. They're looking at the HTA agencies and the payers, but also different groups such as the National Immunization Technical Advisory Groups or NITAGs. And all of these stakeholders together make a decision whether to include the vaccine into the national immunization programs, really the holy grail of that broad access for patients. So we know who the stakeholders are, but one of the key questions is what are the key factors that are driving access for vaccines and how, if they differ between the different stakeholder groups. And that's been the topic of multiple different projects that we've done via our RPR platform. And before we dive into some of the findings, just a brief intro into the RPR platform. It's a platform that enables fast engagement in an agile way with different stakeholders, and we deliver insights from this primary payer research to our clients within 3 weeks of going into field. What I want to highlight here is that in addition to accessing the payer and the HTA agencies in our network that has over 3,000 stakeholders, we also have the NITAG members as well as the KOLs who are advising those groups. And I'll pass on the rest of the presentation to my colleague, Catherine. Catherine is our resident vaccines market access expert. She's led numerous projects on this topic, and she'll go into some of those intricacies of this market.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tiana. So, what really drives vaccine market access? So what I want to talk about in the next few slides is really some of the pooled data from some of our work that we have done across markets such as the EU, US, Japan, but also Middle Eastern countries as well as APAC, involving both payers and NITAG stakeholders to really understand the granularities of what drives their decision making. But first of all, let's think about government priorities for infectious disease prevention. So we've asked our stakeholders what is currently on top of their priority for infectious disease prevention. As you can see, particularly through the impact of COVID-19, there has been a much greater political awareness on respiratory diseases. So we see a lot of mentions of respiratory diseases such as flu and pneumococcus, COVID-19, but also RSV featuring highly in the number of mentions by these stakeholders. And that's really driven by the high medical unmet need and high morbidity and mortality that we see in these diseases, particularly when we think about the elderly population being, of course, a population of high unmet need particularly. But also due to the increase in healthcare resource use and the budget impact on the overall healthcare budgets. We also see other factors highlighted here, antimicrobial resistance, for example, becoming a trend as well. We do see E. coli vaccines being in development as well, but also an increase in vaccination rates because with COVID-19, we have seen an increase in vaccine hesitancy, and that, of course, impacts directly on the success of national immunization programs as well. Now, but when a vaccine comes to market or when a vaccine is going to launch, what really drives the decision by payers and NITAG stakeholders? What factors really influence their decision making? So we asked top level to rate some of the attributes what are important for the decision making. Of course, clinical factors are expected key drivers for vaccine access and reimbursement decision making, particularly when we think of a competitive market of vaccine access. As Tiana has highlighted, a lot of the vaccines in development are already in areas where vaccines are currently available. It's comparative efficacy that they would like to see to understand really which vaccines offer the better benefit. But in addition to the clinical factors, which of course we see as the standard, we ask them around other attributes of vaccines, such as product supply factors, manufacture factors, and the availability of local evidence. And as you can see, all these to some extent play a part in their decision making. Product and supply factors, while they're not necessarily part of the licensing process in itself, they become important after the decision, after efficacy and safety has been established from a logistical standpoint of view. So it actually can drive decisions to tender or reimburse the vaccine, and particularly when we think in a competitive market, it can provide advantages and disadvantages for certain vaccines as well. Manufacturer factors are not necessarily officially considered, but of course they can instill confidence in supply reliability, for example. However, stakeholders highlight that each vaccine should be considered on its own merit. And this is, for example, where we have seen Moderna and the COVID-19 vaccine. Moderna was beforehand a relatively unknown company, but it was assessed on its own merit for the COVID-19 vaccine. Availability of local evidence, that can be quite supportive in mitigating concerns, particularly when we think around Middle Eastern countries or Asian countries where the population demographics are slightly different, to really provide that certainty in the efficacy of the vaccine. So having local clinical trial sites, for example, can be quite advantageous to help with vaccine market access here. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these factors. So thinking first of all about the clinical factors. So we've tested around several different elements around clinical factors and how important they are for their decision making. I think non-surprisingly, highest feature, I say the measures of efficacy such as overall efficacy, prevention of severe disease and prevention of death, because they are defining the overall benefit of the vaccine and also the benefit of the vaccination program in itself. Beyond these clear efficacy measures and safety measures, other factors such as demographic coverage, reactogenicity, and durability are less important, but they're still considered quite important in the overall decision making. Particularly when we think about durability and booster requirements, they can actually have an impact on financial impact because it determines the frequency of booster requirements as well. Now, when we look at it from a stakeholder perspective, what you can see here is they're actually looking between payers and NITAGs. So NITAGs being in orange, payers being in blue. There's not a lot of difference between the stakeholder types in terms of what attributes they consider important. Moving on to product factors for vaccine reimbursement then. As I've highlighted, they are not necessarily critical for access decisions in terms of efficacy, but they become important when it comes to logistical aspects and the decisions whether to tender a vaccine and reimburse a vaccine as well. Now, overall, what we see is that in European countries or developed countries, these factors are less important, but we do see that in Middle Eastern or Asian countries, developing markets, low and middle income markets, particularly things like the stability and shelf life, as well as the distribution, become more important. So, for example, when we think around ultra-low storage requirement, like we've seen for the Pfizer vaccine, that can create challenges, for example, in countries with hot climates, but also in countries that have a larger rural population and not the well-developed distribution networks like we have in the developed markets as well. Of course, supply capacity and reliability is very important for pandemic and endemic situations, as we have experienced, but it's not necessarily a formal requirement, but of course it can disadvantage smaller manufacturers because they don't have the same capacities as larger manufacturers, particularly when we think around providing large supply of vaccines. Again, if we look between stakeholder types, there is not a lot of difference between how payers and NITAG stakeholders actually value these individual factors in terms of how important they are for their decision making. Now, lastly, let's consider the manufacturer factors for decision making. So like I've highlighted, they are not officially considered in any form of decision making, but of course they can set a certain bias for stakeholders. Particularly when we think around reputation, this is probably less likely so in European countries, but in Asian and Middle Eastern countries, what has been highlighted is that they have a greater burden of, for example, counterfeit vaccines, but also the experience with the Dengvaxia vaccine, which was a dengue vaccine that was pulled from the market due to high safety risks. So there is a greater hesitancy and a greater drive for engaging with manufacturers that provide credibility and confidence. Portfolio agreements are not necessarily considered feasible, particularly from a European standpoint of view and US standpoint of view, because the variability in products that manufacturers have. However, in low and middle income countries, it's seen as an opportunity to lock in pricing to manage healthcare expenditures as well. So this is, and just to highlight as well, again, if we look at payers and NITAGs, there's actually not a lot of difference in terms of how these stakeholders rate this type of evidence in terms of importance and of their decision making. Now, this is a brief snapshot of how these individual attributes and pillars of evidence impact on payer and NITAG decision making. Now, I want to talk about two more things that we need to consider when we think about vaccine market access, one being strain coverage and the other one being immunobridging. So let's think about strain coverage. So every vaccine will target a specific strain, genotype, or serotype of a virus, and usually the vaccine is based on the most prevalent strains in circulation. And of course, this can shift over time, like we see with the flu virus and COVID-19 virus mutating, so the prevalence of strains can change. And this will directly impact on the efficacy of the vaccine because it will either cover more or less strains over time. So what we wanted to find out is what is the minimum percentage of circulating strains that a vaccine needs to cover in order to be considered for reimbursement and tendering. And as you can see in the blue shaded weighted distribution graph here, which shows all respondents and split out by payers and NITAGs, is that it's over 70% coverage of circulating strains that a vaccine needs to provide for it to be considered for reimbursement and tendering. Lastly, then, let's think about the acceptability of immunobridging for vaccine market access. So immunobridging is a process where we infer effectiveness of a new vaccine through an accepted surrogate measure. So we compare the ability of a new vaccine to mount a similar immune response to an existing vaccine for which efficacy data is available. So essentially, the data is immunobridged to infer efficacy because it can mount a similar immune response. And this can be used to either expand eligible populations for a current vaccine, or it can be used to launch a new vaccine in that indication. And we have seen, for example, immunobridging being used for the COVID-19 vaccine when it was immunobridged for the infant population, the children, etc. as well. But we wanted to understand what is actually in the real world the acceptability for payers and NITAGs with the immunobridging trials. And this is showing amongst EU stakeholders here and the US stakeholders here. And what we can see is we've tested it around different scenarios. So we've asked around the same vaccine wanting to target a larger population. And you can see just under half, so 44% of stakeholders would consider it acceptable. However, if we move to wanting to immunobridge to a new vaccine, which covers a greater number of strains, or a new vaccine that covers a larger population and greater strains, the acceptability of immunobridging drops significantly. Because payers, NITAGs, want to have certainty around what is the efficacy for against the new strains, but also because it's a new vaccine, so they want to understand overall the efficacy and safety of the vaccine as well. So while immunobridging, it can be quite good in terms of shortening the time for a vaccine to come to market, actually the acceptability when we think about then the access stakeholders is actually quite low. So in summary, in this short presentation, what I hope I've highlighted to you is that it's quite coming from unmet need and government priorities to vaccine access and implementation is a very complex process which involves not only a lot of different attributes like I've gone through, but also a lot of different stakeholders like the payers, the general public, NITAGs, and manufacturers, all that feature into and input into the decision making at one point throughout the journey of vaccine market access. And I hope this has shown the light a little bit on what we think about vaccine market access. We are still trying to understand more on how these processes work, and I'm open for any questions.